I like how as soon as that comes on, everyone gets quiet right when they announce the recording part. I call to order the February 24th, 2025 DRCOG TAC meeting at 1:30. This is an in-person and live stream meeting format. Members of the public attending by Zoom have the ability to mute or unmute themselves and share their webcam. For those attending online, please make sure that you have your typed name reflects your first and last name and who you represent. We ask that those attending to speak using the raise hand button to ask a question or to comment on an agenda item. If you have any technical questions, you can direct those to staff in the chat box and they will respond. As a reminder to members and alternates here in person, please press the unmute button on the bottom of your mic stand. You can tell because the light comes on, and make sure it's on. And when you are prepared to speak, speak directly in your microphone or your so that your voice will amplify. Finally, please always remember to announce your name and your representation when asking a question or making a comment for the record. During our business agenda, TAC members and alternates can speak or ask questions. Members of the public may speak during public comment. DRCOG is sending around a sign-up sheet, so make sure you sign in. And at this time, we're going to have TAC members and alternates introduce themselves in person. And I think we'll start way in that back corner over there.
Yeah, I'm Evan Pinkham with Weld County.
Larry Nimmo, City of Castle Pines, Douglas County.
Chris Hudson, Town of Parker, Douglas County.
Jeff Dinkenbring, Arapahoe County, City of Centennial.
Kent Mormon, Adams County, City of Thornton.
Jeff Boyd, Housing Special Interest.
Michelle Riccio, Adams County. Jenna Hahn, Adams County and City of Commerce City.
Frank Bruno, via Mobility Services.
Cam Kennedy, DRCOG staff.
Dustin Schmitz, City of Lone Tree, representing Douglas County.
Jacob Rieger, DRCOG staff. Also, Ron Papsdorf will be here in a few minutes, so Ron Papsdorf, DRCOG staff.
Jim Houston with CDOT Region 4.
Jessica Mickeldust, CDOT Region 1.
Michelle Molinaka, City of Lafayette, Boulder County.
Jim Kotzer, Arapahoe County, Arapahoe County.
Jennifer Bartlett, City and County of Denver.
Tom Moore, Regional Air Quality Council.
Amy Saxton, I'm with Clear Creek County, but I'm a non-NPO planning member, and this is my first meeting. Dean Sampson, City of Boulder.
Chris Quinn with RTD.
Alex Hydrate, Boulder County.
Carolyn Clam, DRCOG staff.
David Kretzinger, City and County of Denver.
Carson Priest, TDM Special Interest Sheet.
Maria DeAndre, City of Wheat Ridge, Jefferson County.
Grant Slaughterland, Arapahoe County, City of Littleton.
Whitaker, Jeff Coe, and City of Lakewood.
Christina Lane, Jefferson County.
Okay, thank you very much. Did we miss anyone? Okay, looks like we're good. I am going to pass the mic over to Jacob for a quick announcement about new members and alternates.
Thank you, Chair Schmidt. So I actually want to recognize a couple of folks. So Amy, you introduced yourself, but I wanted to formally introduce Amy Saxton of Clear Creek County. You may not know this, we actually have what's called a non-MPO seat on our Transportation Advisory Committee, both Clear Creek County and Gilpin County, and it's a shared seat between the two. So we have this shared non-MPO seat. They are members of DRCOG, but they are outside of our MPO boundary. So we have this seat to kind of recognize their contributions, and we've been working to fill it. So Amy, I had to look up your title, but Amy Saxton is the Strategic and Community Planning Division Director for Clear Creek County, and we are so glad that you're here as a non-MPO representative. And then I also wanted to recognize Evan Pinkham, who is a relatively new, been involved for a long time, but relatively new formal sort of alternate for Southwest Weld. Evan, it's good to see you here today too.
Thank you, Jacob, and welcome to our new members. We'll now move into our public comment. So we will now open the meeting for public comment. Please remember, public comment is limited to 3 minutes. And if you've joined by Zoom, please raise your hand by pressing the raise hand button, and we'll call on you to begin speaking. If you joined by phone, please raise your virtual hand by pressing *9. We will call on you by the last 3 digits of your phone number, Staff will unmute you, and then you will need to unmute yourself by pressing *6 on your phone. You'll have 3 minutes to speak, after which we will ask you to wrap up and your line will be muted. As a reminder, after the public comment period, only TAC members and alternates will partake in the discussions regarding each agenda item. So with public comment being open, Kenny, do we have any public comment online?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll give it a second, but I do not see any hands raised online.
Anyone in person?
Or in
Gotta
person.
turn around.
Yeah. Nope.
All right. Well, with that, we will close public comment. Also, at this time, we will move on the January 27th, 2025 tax summary. This was attachment A in your packet. Is there any discussion, corrections, or questions about the January 27th, 2025 TAC meeting? Seeing none, I believe those minutes can stand as written. Okay, we will move on today. We have no action items today on the agenda, so we will skip our action items and move straight into our discussion items. Our first item for discussion today is the Regional Air Quality Council Indirect Source Emissions Control Program. This is attachment B in your packet. And I believe Ron Papsdorf, the Transportation Planning and Operations Director for DRCOG, will be presenting or kicking off.
Here, sorry, Ron Papsdorf. I'm actually just handing off to RAC staff. I believe Tom Moore is leading the presentation today on behalf of RAC. This presentation,
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Moore with the Denver Metro North Front Range Regional Air Quality Council, and I'm joined by my colleague Carol Ruman Moore, who will also be presenting today. I wanted to brief the Transportation Advisory Committee on an initiative we're working on. We started it last fall, and it's kind of a new idea in the metro area. So we're going to introduce you all to the idea, and happy to try and field questions when it's over. All right, thank you. So maybe we should start with a definition. Indirect sources, this is from the Federal Clean Air Act. They're facilities or installations that cause substantial mobile emissions activity. So some common examples would be warehouses, industrial or commercial developments, residential structures, construction sites, entertainment venues, a variety of different places that we all use generate trips to go to and from. They generate trips to stock and satisfy those facilities. So maybe it'd be helpful to just kind of put things in boxes here, so that's what we're doing. On the left-hand side is the way that air pollution control has been managed, for a very long time, 50 plus years, and that's to identify sources, stationary sources or mobile sources, and put tailpipe or smokestack type controls on them by setting emission limits in permits or regulation. These programs are well established and successful, but it does not address the growth in the number of individual emission sources. So everybody's jurisdictions here on the TAC are dealing with growth, and people come here with the cars and practices that they have, and so those kinds of traditional air pollution control methods aren't super successful for growth. So we're vetting the idea of an indirect source regulation of some kind. It doesn't tackle individual vehicle emissions, but it's the collective emissions from the existing vehicle miles traveled. That'll continue to grow, of course, and it regulates developments, the facilities, to reduce emissions from construction and operation. So this is a practice that's used in some other jurisdictions. Here's the history of the indirect source rule from the Clean Air Act. It started in 1970. This was an original requirement from the Federal Clean Air Act that continued for about 10 years while EPA put out guidance and gave examples of transportation controls. This was dealt with large parking capacity, new highways, busy airports. We have a colleague who used to be very active in the transportation planning effort in the Denver metro area, and he talks about his work in Minnesota, where they changed the time of a football game in order to lower car emissions of people traveling there. So that's an example of a kind of strategy that can be employed. Starting in the 80s, these were cut back. They weren't required by EPA, but in 1990, which was the last major update to the Clean Air Act, these were reintroduced, and states like Colorado that don't meet the air quality standards were allowed to voluntarily add those to the state implementation plan. So here are some examples of where ISRs or ISPs are currently being implemented in the South Coast District of Southern California, 30 million people, San Joaquin Valley, some of the largest industrial and agricultural activities in the world. The state of Oregon has a statewide permitting program for indirect sources, as does Washington, D.C. So 3 of these 4 areas, they've developed this program specifically to deal with non-attainment or violating the air quality standards. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kira, and she's going to do the rest.
Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit, now that Tom's given a really great background on this topic, about the work group that we've stood up to look at and explore having an indirect source program or programs in the North Front Range, Denver metro area. So we started meeting with the work group in the fall and held monthly meetings, looking really to just set a common understanding of where we are on this issue, both nationally and in Colorado, what work has been done, what data we have, and what the options are to explore going forward. So there was a lot of discussion, sharing perspectives, trying to engage the relevant stakeholders, and I'll talk a little bit more about what we covered on the next slide. So we had presentations on existing programs. So Tom mentioned some of those. We also talked quite a bit about what the legal considerations are, as well as the data analysis considerations to stand up a program such as this. And then we had a variety of stakeholder presentations. So everything from experts in the field to environmental organizations, government representatives, and industry. The group tried to come up with a variety of norms to keep the discussions collaborative and productive. Those included things like staying engaged in conversation, trying to share the airtime, make sure that lots of different perspectives are being heard. Again, a real theme of collaboration and focusing on tangible outcomes. And so the goals overall from the fall meetings were to review existing programs from other regions around the country, understand how those work, think about what potential benefits and roadblocks could be to establishing different types of indirect source emission reduction programs in our region, and then start to think about what a proposed framework might look like for a program here. And so those 3 top bullets are what the RAC staff had come up with, and we got additional input from participants in the work group that they were really interested in understanding the costs and benefits of such a program. Again, in really looking at tangible solutions, and for some, really an interest in making them federally enforceable in our state implementation plan for ozone, and again, ensuring a collaborative process. So this is a little bit out of date, this list, but this is what we had come up with in the fall in terms of just the variety of types of stakeholders to engage with. So everything from community and environmental groups, industry, government, and transit and transportation groups, including maybe all of you and the groups that you represent. So we've had a good amount of success in engaging all of these different types of stakeholders, and I'll talk a little in a moment about we've come up with some more subgroups and are looking to flesh out the participation in those groups based on the specific areas that we're investigating. So a little bit more about the process and timeline for the work group now that you've heard the background about what we were able to accomplish in the fall. So this is a busy slide, but basically this provides taking a step back from the work group itself, some context about what the RAC is doing over the next several months. So we have a state implementation plan for ozone that is due to our board for their consideration and endorsement in June of this year. And in anticipation of that process and knowing that we need to do more to attain the ozone standard, we are investigating a number of different types of control strategies that we think can help us make progress in reducing emissions. And so the indirect source emissions work group is one piece of that larger project that we're working on, and we're reporting out regularly to our control strategy committee, which meets monthly, as well as our board, about the work that we're doing at the work group. So the indirect source emission reduction idea is one that, in order to attain the standard, we, in the SIP, we are looking at what we can achieve by 2026. Any indirect source emission reductions are more likely to come online slowly, but still could have real and significant benefits in the more 2027 to 2030 time period when we recognize there will be more work we need to do. So this is just a list of additional strategies we're considering in that time period, as well as adopted regulations that are already on the books and that will also be reducing emissions in that time period, such as the Advanced Clean Cars, Clean Trucks rule. So starting in January, we are now having monthly meetings of three, what we're calling sub-work groups within the indirect sources work group. And these are focused on warehouses, entertainment and recreation venues, and airports and universities as little mini cities in some ways. And so our goal in choosing these is to hone in and evaluate on evaluating and developing next steps in areas that came up a lot in our discussions in the fall, and where we think that we have a lot of evidence and some existing data, at least, that these sources have, they generate a high number of trips, a high number of vehicle miles traveled, and or are associated with high emitting vehicles. And these all have really notable economic activity associated with them as well. So we think we're hoping to be able to guide the development of programs, whether voluntary or regulatory, that produce emissions in the near to medium term related to these areas. And of course, you know, based on state priorities, we also want to make sure that we're incorporating environmental justice considerations into these conversations. So we wanted to share some information about our next work group meeting. It is tomorrow, so kind of short notice, but we welcome additional participation. Each sub-work group is meeting for 1 hour in the order that you see listed on the screen. We're also going to continue meeting the fourth Tuesday of each month in the same schedule going forward. We are in the process of collecting comments on draft charge statements for each work group that defines the area of focus for the work group and what information we need to put together to come up with a proposal to take to the RAC board. And this is just some reference information if you're interested in learning more about what the work group has done to date. There's a memo from our January meeting that has information about the legal authority around indirect sources in the state, and some presentations that are pretty comprehensive about what we've done so far. And then from our January 28th meeting, which was the first one of the sub-work groups, that was the first draft of each of the charge statements. And if you're interested, again, please reach out, because we do have some information that is now getting updated on a shared Google Drive with all the stakeholders, and so we'd be happy to share that with you as well. So with that, happy to take any questions. We're happy to share more about the effort if you have any questions about this area that we're working on. We really, again, would encourage involvement from local and state agencies and government representatives that deal in the transportation or transit space. We also are open to any suggestions for future speakers or stakeholders that you know of that you think should be involved in this effort, or anything else. And we have this generic email inbox that both Tom and I have access to if anyone would like to reach out that way as well. So thanks again for your time, and Tom and I are happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much to RAC staff for that presentation. We have a good guide here for the open discussion. So any questions or any of those other items that someone would like to bring up? Looks like we have one here from Michelle.
Just a quick question. I think a bunch of agencies are trying to figure out how to deal with the new TOD density bills and laws around residential density and requirements there. Are you all incorporating that into your study, and is the plan to support that effort?
We have had a couple of presentations where people talked about kind of land use considerations in relation to this project, and that's certainly, you know, part of the equation, but it's not, I would say, not the main focus in some ways. So we haven't talked specifically about those, you know, new guidance or regulations. Tom, do you have anything to add on that?
I just add quickly that that bill probably is a longer term solution than we're trying to work at. So we're thinking sort of next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, that helps define that. Thank you. Other questions?
Hey.
We'll go Brody.
Thank you. Brody Ayers, Aviation Special Interest Representative on TAC. So my question comes as a perspective from airports as listed, right? I know we've been engaged at our airport, but I'm curious about what other airports you might have engaged with, and I might help engage with those airports.
Yeah, so far, you know, we've definitely mainly had participation from the Denver airport. We do have a board member from the Centennial Airport who's also involved, but would certainly welcome connections. We've tried to do some outreach, but these are new types of stakeholders for us to engage with, and so we don't have all those existing connections. So yeah, if you have any or know of any other airports that you know, we should be engaging with or have connections there, we'd welcome that.
Great. Mr. Papsdorf.
Thank you very much. Ron Papsdorf for DRCOG. Maybe it would help the folks around this room maybe think about this and give you some feedback if they had some ideas about some examples of what regulations of indirect sources might look like. I think they might be struggling with, I don't know how to react to this because I don't exactly know what to anticipate, what this might mean for my jurisdiction or my agency. You know, if this applies to warehouses, does this apply to all existing warehouses across all jurisdictions or new proposed? And if it does apply to certain uses, like what might be required, since a lot of these generators are located within all of them are located within local jurisdictions across this region. That would help them give you some feedback or thoughts.
Sure, yeah, that's a great point, thanks. So I'll take a stab at describing some of it and then let Tom add anything as well. So I think the most well built out version of an indirect source program to look at as an example is the WARE rule, which focuses on warehouses in the South Coast. And the way that rule works is it applies to warehouses of a certain square footage or greater. So not every single tiny warehouse, but I think is it 10,000 square feet? 100,000 square feet or larger. And so then within the program, they basically have created a menu of options and with those, each option, a point allocation, and warehouses have to do a certain number of actions to add up to a certain number of points in order to comply with the regulation. It's also phased in over a number of years based on size and other considerations. So that's definitely one model that we've looked really closely at, but I would also, so hopefully that's an illustrative example, but I'll also emphasize that we're not trying to just copy exactly what was done in California and really trying to think about what makes sense here. And for the entertainment and recreation, airports and universities groups, there aren't existing programs focusing on exactly those types of venues or facilities. And so this is in some ways new ground to be treading. And so we're having a lot of conversations with stakeholders about what that might look like, what are the criteria or thresholds to consider in terms of, who might be subject to a regulation or a program, a voluntary program, and so on. Yeah, so Tom was just mentioning there are other programs that look very different. So the San Joaquin Valley program in California is really just focused on new developments and trying to reduce emissions associated with those. So with the process of building them and then once they're built as well. And I guess one other thing I'll mention about the WARE program, there are also offset options in there in terms of, if you can't reduce the number of trips to and from your facility, can you install more or work towards electrification on site or install more electric infrastructure, or even paying into a program, paying a fee that then goes towards emission reduction efforts elsewhere.
Thank you for that. I believe a question, Kent, over here.
I have one and then a follow-up. Do you foresee this as a voluntary program or a required program coming out?
We don't have a clear answer to that question yet. It really depends how the conversations continue with stakeholders. I think, we're looking at both options for sure. I think it's unlikely in the short term that we'll be looking at, regulations for all three work group areas, but we'll see what we can come up with, whether it's pilot programs or voluntary measures to start with in some areas. If we can get to a regulation that's phased in over time, all options are still on the table right now.
The reason I ask that is it'll be interesting to see how you overcome our Colorado Constitution that has home rule, and the cities and the counties oversee with home rule land use and to the building permit, et cetera. It's sounding like you're wanting a statewide or region-wide program. Just ask that question. You're going to get a lot of resistance, as we saw last year and some this year, on variation of a home.
Yeah, so thanks for pointing that out. There is existing authority both in the Clean Air Act at the federal level and here in Colorado specifically around defining what indirect sources are and what authority there is around that at the state, but that's something we're continuing to clarify and have conversations on as well.
Yep, Jacob.
Okay, so Kira and Tom, as we've kind of shared in previous meetings, struggling just a little bit with the actual definition or the meaning of the term indirect sources. And so, for example, when we think about things like airports, universities, recreational facilities like folks going to a Rockies game or whatever, those are things that we should largely be capturing in our regional traffic model. Maybe an outdated term, but when I was starting modeling, it was special generators, right? But we have those in the models, like airport traffic, for example, trying to capture that unique sort of traffic pattern within the model. So as one example, I guess struggling just a little bit, where's the line between an indirect source versus what's already accounted for in our regional traffic modeling, travel modeling, and air quality conformity analysis? Can you help just explain that a little bit more?
So I think this slide is our attempt to talk about this, and it may not fall neatly into the same lines that you think about for modeling, but it's really about where is the authority coming from to regulate these types of facilities, and what are the considerations that go into the more traditional approaches versus looking at these facility-based considerations, because you all have those kinds of accommodations in your modeling, but that's not typically how traditional air pollution control programs have worked or have looked at things. You want to add to that?
So Jacob, the way I think about indirect sources and how it relates to mobile source modeling is that what you all do is kind of a one-way solution where how do you move enough traffic to Coors Field and get it out of there? So that's a near scale and large scale kind of problem to solve. This kind of program seeks to establish a incentive for the source itself to change the profile of what vehicles and how many trips there are. So just a simple example is maybe at Coors Field, you'll start getting a free beer if you take the bus to the game. I mean, that's an example of where the source would do something. That's just an example. I know, right? Okay. We know what Ron's motivation is now. But anyway, but the point is that right now, the sources themselves don't have any motivation to change the profile or the number of trips that, go to and from that facility. So these programs go in that direction.
All right, thank you very much for that. Do we have any other questions or comments? All right, thank you very much for that update and the ally to get more people to the Rockies game. So that was potentially a good strategy there, Ally. All right. Up next, we have item number 5. Is an update on the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan, the Financial Plan, and Regional Roadway System. This was Attachment C in your packet. And Alvin Badal Sanchez, the Regional Transportation Planning Program Manager, will be presenting.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. So hopefully a hot topic today, 2 major activities that we conduct during our Regional Transportation Plan update. I'll start with an overview of our financial plan and then a potential proposal for our regional roadway system, provide a quick check-in on what each of those means for DRCOG and for the Regional Transportation Plan. I'm going to start with our financial plan. You're not going to be seeing any new figures here for this next planning cycle, but more of a 101. Ask any questions y'all might have related to our financial plan before we get into any of the official forecasting that we're doing over the next 25 years for our 2050 Regional Transportation Plan. So for some quick basics level setting, you'll hear us mention this pretty often during this plan cycle, but our regional transportation plan is not a budget document. We do attempt to capture costs of projects, but they're high level costs. So we cannot tell you how much, what percentage of a particular project is going to what particular funding code, fund source. But we do try to, at a high level, calculate a funding framework for the region over the next 25 years. So what do we think we can afford in the first 5 years of the plan, the next 5 years of the plan, and so on and so forth. So it is a long-range vision. It does establish our investment priorities for the next 25 years, but we don't get down into the details of any project budget. And then we do attempt to capture all the transportation revenues that we think will be spent in the region on the various facilities over the next 25 years. We use a number of different data sources for that, and I'll touch on a couple of those during this presentation. And then if you do have any desire for more information on our financial plan, we do have a whole appendix H linked in the presentation that goes into each of the different fund codes, fund sources that is made up in our regional transportation plan, who controls those, how we inflated them, how they've been broken down into various funding tiers and staging periods to show that we are being reasonable with the assumptions that we're making for our federal partners. There are 3 pieces to our financial plan. First is revenue forecast. How much do we think is actually available over the next 25 years? Expenditure categories. How are we breaking down that funding between projects and programs? And then estimated project costs. So we know what a project might cost in today's dollars, what might it cost 20 years from now, 30 years from now. So starting with revenue forecast, we rely on CDOT's program distribution for funding that DRCOG administers and CDOT administers. So when you see us go through our calls for projects, those are the fund sources that we're talking about in our regional transportation plan. We rely on RTD for their financial forecast for funding that's administered by them that they receive. We do work with RTD to firm up the transit assumptions in our regional transportation plan for other transit sources that might not go to RTD but that do come to the region. We do attempt to incorporate federal discretionary grants in our regional transportation plan. This region has a pretty successful history of receiving discretionary grants through various programs, and so want to try and capture that and annualize that in our regional transportation plan and be reasonable with those assumptions. And then we do coordinate with toll authorities to also include their investments. I'll also note that in addition to coordinating with toll authorities, we also receive information related to the funding that's being spent by our local member governments as well. So we do try to capture everything that might be spent on our system over the next 25 years. For the expenditure categories, I mentioned that we look at projects versus programs in the regional transportation plan. A project is what it sounds like. It is a line and dot on the map. If you open up our web map, go to our regional transportation plan, look at any of those figures. These are the individually listed projects in the plan. And then we have what we call programmatic investments. You might also hear us call them programs, buckets, lump sum allocations, but those are investments that we do not show particular projects for. We're not showing every sidewalk that's going to be built over the next 30 years, every bus route that's going to be running over the next 30 years, but we do try to capture that because we know it's going to be spent. And in terms of estimating project costs, these are planning level cost estimates. We rely on our project sponsors to provide that information for us. And it's intended to include all the different phases that it will take to open that project or deliver that project fully. So design, construct, right-of-way acquisition, open. For implementation timeline, we do base that on when we think the project will open for traffic or open for revenue service if we're looking at our capacity projects. And these are tied to our staging periods that we have in the plan. So we're required to show federal air quality conformity and state greenhouse gas compliance. So we use those timeframes in the plan for when a project might open to show across those different modeling horizon years. We do distribute projects across the life of the plan. So this next plan, we're looking at a 25-year plan. We cannot show every project opening in 2027 after we've adopted the plan in 2026 as much as we would like to. So we do distribute those reasonably with the funding that we think is available through the life of the plan, and that makes sense with conversations with our project sponsors and where that project might be in its project development phase. And related to the implementation timeline, we do inflate the cost of a project in the regional transportation plan. If you tell us it's $25 million today, it will not be $25 million 20 years from now. So we do try to capture what that inflation could look like, so taking some of our fiscal constraint away as we do grow both revenues and project costs. So that was a quick overview of the financial plan. Chair, I'll defer to you if you'd like me to pause here for questions or continue on to the second piece of the presentation.
I think we're okay to go on.
The next piece is our regional roadway system. If you'd like to see what this network looks like currently, it is available as a layer in our DRCOG data tool. So that's the screenshot you're currently seeing on the screen. This is the network that we set at the beginning of a regional transportation plan cycle. And so there are a number of key pieces for why we do set this before the plan update. It's currently made up of current, existing, built, and future freeways, tollways, what we call major regional arterials, and principal arterials. It's our planning network that we use for our modelings. When we talk about federal air quality conformity and state greenhouse gas modeling, this is the network that we're talking about and that we use for our various models. It's the network that we have for eligible capacity projects in both the regional transportation plan and the transportation improvement program. So if you are at any point seeking a project in the RTP or the TIP, it does need to be on this network for capacity improvements. The idea is that these are the most heavily traveled, the most important connecting roadways in our region. And the goal is to limit the federal funding that we target, our limited federal funding that we receive to the most important roadways. So there are a lot of roadways in our region. We cannot put all of our federal funding on all of that network. So we do create a subset of that to target that limited funding. Like I mentioned, we set this at the beginning of each plan update cycle. Staff have been reviewing the current network and have some proposed revisions for discussion today at this meeting. We've looked at the federal aid eligibility of all roadways. There's a certain classification that federal dollars cannot be spent on, so we want to make sure that the roadways we're including in our regional roadway system meet that threshold, and if they don't, that we know a way to fix that. We are wanting to confirm that all Colorado state highways are on the network. That's been a point that we make during our regional roadway system discussions, is trying to capture the full state highway system, and so we want to make sure that's been captured. We've checked in all urban areas to make sure principal arterials are already included in the network, and then there are a couple scenarios for a proposed expansion that we'll go through today that we'd like some discussion around to expand the network to include minor arterials or major collectors in rural areas, and you'll see slides for each of those and what that could mean. So I'll start with our current system. There's a little over 2,000 centerline miles of the regional roadway system. If you know a particular point in the region, I'm just going to click through a series of slides so you can just see how that might change with the particular scenario that's being proposed. But this is the current network as it exists. It is just showing the network. It is not looking at the different designations that we've provided in the system. It's also not delineating between what's planned and what's existing. So it is just our current regional system right now. First piece that we explored was making sure all state highways were on the network, and during that exploration we found a little over 200 centerline miles that we don't believe are on the current regional roadway system. So everything in dark blue would be a proposal to add potentially some major important connections for our mountain communities, maybe some secondary alternate routes, looking at like the Eastern Plains I-70. So this would be the first proposal to spur discussion, including all state highways within the region. You might see some spurs right here during this particular scenario. As I click through them, you might see those disappear or maintain. We could have some conversation on those as well. Second piece would be adding rural minor arterials, so everything in magenta. As I click through this, the gray is now both the existing regional roadway system and the state highway system, assuming it was proposed and included. So magenta would be everything added going down one level to rural minor arterials in the region. That adds about 52 centerline miles to the system. And then going even further, a rural major collector exploration. So everything in yellow being added to our regional roadway system. This adds 240 centerline miles to the system, about a 12% increase from what we currently have on our regional roadway system, and then put all together. So the two dialog boxes to the right showing what two scenarios could look like for this particular update to the regional roadway system. So we could add up to 263 centerline miles to the roadway system. That would include state highways and then rural minor arterials. A potential proposal could also be adding 500 centerline miles to the regional roadway system, again, including state highways, rural minor arterials, but then going another level further into rural major collectors. Well, I can jump in between each of these slides as needed, but I do just want to show the quick questions to spur discussion. As DRCOG staff look to revise the network, are there any considerations we should be taking into account, criteria you'd like us to look at? As you saw those slides, what are some potential benefits or drawbacks of these proposed staff-initiated revisions that you have come to mind during this presentation? Are there any impacts, good or bad, to your own planning process as we look to expand the regional roadway system? And then we do intend to hold a solicitation for other revisions to the regional roadway system. We have always had that for a regional transportation plan, so that will still occur. But are there other revisions that you would like staff to explore that might just occur automatically before the solicitation opens? We do have some next steps for both of these deliverables. Coordinating with our regional partners, we've reached out to CDOT and RTD for our financial forecast to start building our financial plan. We do want to open a solicitation for the regional roadway system by our regional partners and local member governments. We will be coming back before y'all with a future recommendation to the RTC and ultimately to the board to set this network later this year. And then we would also, as needed, work with local governments to make sure that the functional classification data shown in our network is federal aid eligible. Thank you, Chair.
All right, thank you, Alvin, for that presentation. Any questions? Yes, Kent.
Just a question, by adding these additional miles, does that affect your greenhouse gas calculation? Help it, hurt it, keep it the same? Just curious. Traveled.
Our travel model already includes more roadways than just the regional roadway system, and we do try to capture other types of roadways that might not fall to this particular threshold. So we have not done a one-for-one analysis between both networks, but we think our travel model already captures much of the roadway network and the traffic in the region.
And just the second one on the financial, I hope you have a clear crystal ball.
We do. Can we borrow it? Yeah. Other questions? Chris.
On your financial plan, you talked a little bit about the crystal ball. What are you following the Colorado Construction Cost Index, trying to project out that line that, say, very steep line compared to a lot of other things? I was just curious what you're using in your model.
So it was the construction cost index 4 or 5 years ago, but it wasn't the most recent available data set. We did try to average that from a number of years. So not using the most recent potential spike in inflation that we're seeing, but what could an average inflation cost across 30 years look like that captures the growth we're seeing, but doesn't overwhelm our financial plan with pretty intense inflation rates.
I think the guy from CDOT, Stevens' his name, I've talked to him a couple of times. I mean, his 12-year trend is 8% per year increase. So I was just curious, what percentage are you guys using in your model?
I believe the current regional transportation plan uses 3.4% inflation. The revenue forecasts grew slightly slower than that, I think 2.3% last cycle. So we don't We don't grow them evenly, so we know project costs grow faster than the revenues that we have available. And so we did keep those separate last RTP cycle, but 3.4% was last update.
Thank you.
Let's try that again. There we go. Just to add one point to Alvin's excellent answer. I mean, keep in mind, this is a 2050 regional transportation plan, right? So we're looking 25 years in the future, and we recognize over those 25 years, we're going to have these up and down economic cycles. Right now, inflation's really bad, and we should account for that for sure. But we also know that in the next 25 years, we're going to have robust economic growth. We're going to have a recession, probably more than one. We're going to have other things happen that we can't really anticipate. So what we're looking for is our sort of best data analysis, our best educated planning guess at a planning level of detail, what's going to happen to both, you know, project costs and revenue growth over time, average that out, and demonstrate that the plan in a sort of YOE or year of expenditure state will still be fiscally constrained in 2050 as we may show in current revenue dollars, current year dollars.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob, for that addition. This way first, okay.
Yeah, Alvin, thank you for that presentation. So assuming that the impetus for this is to expand the network out into rural areas so that there's greater parity between the urban areas and the rural areas, is that correct?
That is one piece. I would say maybe the larger underlying point is just recognizing that rural roadways may function a little differently and are a little more important connection than you might see in an urban area where there's more, I forget the word I'm trying to find, duplicative, resilient travel options, but it is a factor.
Right. Okay, so thank you. So with that, so this expands the eligibility of projects in rural areas to be incorporated into the regional transportation plan. So I'm thinking like back to the last regional transportation update, were there projects or plans for improvements in these rural areas to these state highways and rural minor arterials that would have benefited from being included in the plan? And maybe that's why we're seeing it now?
Can't recall the full project list at the moment. For the regional transportation plan, we do include projects that aren't capacity improvements, so roadway widening transit capacity projects. So there were some like bicycle, pedestrian trail projects that are included in maybe the non-urbanized area that we did include last cycle in a mountain or Eastern Plains community. But this, through the expansion, would open up the types of projects that could be identified in a planning process and carried forward in a number of different ways.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Gene. I think we had a question first over here. I think Brody. Here's
multiple part question, I guess. So defining rule would be helpful for. Then also, as you're looking at this going to 2050, a lot of these areas are going to be exponential growth, especially, and so better understanding how that would influence funding, right? If it moves from a rural to urban funding amount, I don't know, many questions in there. But.
Yeah, so we used the rural classification that's based on whether the area was within an urbanized area by the census. So there are a number of different geographies we could use for that. We do just have our most recent smooth urbanized boundary that we could use, but it relies on a geography created by the U.S. Census and worked with our MPO partners. So it can be a weird geography if you just look at that, but that's how we distinguish between an urban versus rural. As you look at this map, you might see some areas that you're like, well, why don't you just connect that roadway? What is this interesting gap that you've incorporated by just using rural? In that case, we would look at how does it make sense to add that particular facility? Should it just be that stub because it's considered rural, or should it be that full length that connects rationally to another part of the system? So that's how we've defined urban versus rural for this particular category. We haven't historically cared whether it's urban versus rural in our own regional roadway system. We just include freeways, tollways, major regional arterials, and principal arterials, and our only designation is whether it's existing or future. So we haven't used the urban v. rural designation in our own system. This was just an exercise if we wanted to set a threshold for these areas that are outside the urban core, what might make sense to just ad hoc include, by default include. So the growth that you expect to see around the airport, that wouldn't change our system. We would still want to show those major roadways that are around the airport, regardless of whether they're urban, rural, whether they are current or future, since our system does include both. And that could be a project sponsor initiated revision. So we do still want to have that solicitation where we hear from y'all, are there other revisions we should be making based on your own planning work, the work you're seeing on the ground that this roadway makes sense to include for the region.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to go
follow on to that. We won't
Yep.
follow like that's traditional path of allocating money between urban and funding projects.
It's a separate designation that CDOT uses. This is just using the census places. I'm not sure the CDOT definition. It might be like not MPO area, but I defer to other staff on hand who are sure of that distinction.
Correct.
Yes, thank you, Alvin. This is Ron Papsdorf, DRCOG. Brody, for this purposes, as Alvin has explained, kind of rural, urban is sort of just based on census designated urbanized areas to help us think about those areas outside of urbanized areas if we should consider a network. In terms of funding, from a CDOT perspective, rural is outside of MPO boundaries, urban is outside of MPO boundaries, and our MPO boundary is larger than the urbanized area designation. That helps.
And for the purposes of the regional transportation plan, when we're looking at fiscal constraint, we're bringing together all of the project costs, all of the investments, and all of the dollars. It's not a budget document, so we're not, for the most part, assigning specific types of dollars or revenues to specific projects. So it's not so much for us whether it's urban or rural from a project funding perspective. It's about defining our regional roadway network for analysis and then going through the plan update, including projects and fiscal constraint and the other elements of the plan.
All right, sorry. I would almost encourage you not to use the word then. Just put a road on the roadway system, right? And like, then you're not confusing entities or municipalities and things.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to go to Tom Moore, and then we're coming back to Michelle, because I didn't see you, but I think I heard John first.
Thank you. Alvin, I had a specific question and then a more general one. Can you remind us whether the greenhouse gas and the conformity staging years are the same?
They are not. We have some flexibility with the staging years for federal air quality conformity. So we've been working on what those staging periods could look like for this update cycle. But last cycle, they did not match. And so we have some flexibility with what those tiers and periods end up being.
Thank you. So this is, maybe it's related to questions other people are asking. What would happen if you put the road network in Weld and Larimer County up against this? Is there any kind of process to coordinate on adding lane miles in the northern part of the service area?
I'm sorry, do you mean like outside our COG boundary, just to see how we might be coordinating roadway investments?
Well, those roads don't stop. I mean, they keep going. So I'm asking you, how do you get information about what they're doing, about what
Gotcha.
they plan?
Yeah, so we've coordinated with both the North Front Range MPO and the Pikes Peak Area Council of Governments, just in general, on any project priorities that they're seeing cross both of our boundaries to the north and the south. I'm not sure actually, I should clarify that. PPACG and North Front Range MPO do use different networks than we do, so they don't create a subset of the federal aid eligible system. PPACG just uses the federal aid eligible system and goes to that threshold that's allowed with federal funding, and then North Front Range MPO does have a different network than our regional roadway system. So we do at least try to coordinate when projects might span our boundaries, and as planning products like our active transportation plan might span boundaries. So we do it through a couple coordination pieces with them. And then we also have our interagency consultation group that includes North Front Range MPO. We can have some more of those technical modeling questions.
Yeah, and we also, from a modeling perspective, do tie into our neighbors both to the north and south, and we do They're called external stations, I believe, in the model, but we do actually account for the traffic going into and out of our region to our neighboring regions. And our focus model, our travel demand model, actually extends a little bit beyond kind of our DRCOG boundary to help kind of capture some of those nearby kind of outside areas from a sort of seamless traffic modeling perspective and to help with air quality conformity analysis.
All right, thank you very much. And then Michelle.
Hey, Alvin, thanks so much for this. This is super helpful. For the solicitation, do you have a rough timeline for when you think it might be open and also how long it could be open for?
So we are planning it to be open a month, and we're hoping late next month for it to open.
And then one more question too. So Adams County is going through a project to review how we apply or implement functional class and define it in our development standard code. So what is the best way to stay engaged with you on that topic if we have any changes based on that project? And this is also just for unincorporated Adams County areas too.
That's a great question. We've also reached out to CDOT to determine how they maintain those attributes within their own system to make sure that when we're pulling that data, if we see a roadway that's not federally aid eligible, we know a way to classify that. So I would say just keep me in touch as that process goes along. It's okay if a particular system at a particular point they don't align perfectly. This is more of a subset of that network, so we don't use those classifications beyond just wanting it to be on our regional roadway system, but we can have a better idea of what a change to that might look like working with the state.
Thank you, Michelle. Yes, Kent Mormon.
Alvin, just a refresher. Have you looked at, we've updated a lot of transportation plans in the community region. Have you looked at those, or are you expecting us, when you have that open call, to provide you, hey, instead of a 2-lane, this is going to be a 4-lane in our jurisdiction? How have you handled it? Are you expecting locals to really eyeball those for you, or have you already looked at those plans?
Only at a high level, so we would rely on our local government project sponsors to be the ones providing that information, especially if there's a most recent planning part that's occurred, making sure that we're showing the facility appropriately and that it's included in an adopted plan and the rationale for any potential revisions for that. So we would lean on our project sponsors for that information.
Okay. Papsdorf.
And again, on Papsdorf. Just to clarify one point, the question you raise is appropriate, but it's not exactly related to this. The regional roadway system definition process doesn't say this facility will be this facility will be that. It's really just defining the network. There's future work to go in terms of the planning process, in terms of identifying future needs, future plans to make improvements or not, and set priorities about allocating all of our collective resources to improving or changing transportation. That make sense?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking a step or two ahead when you get to the fiscal.
No, that's an important clarification. So this is a separate solicitation from our project priorities that we'll be having later in the summer too. It will help set the stage for it, but this is a separate first step to first just set the network before we go into any project improvements on it. A quick, we're not asking for an official recommendation from the body this afternoon, but maybe a gut check from members, seeing these couple of scenarios. How are they landing on folk? Are there any potential that we could, as staff, explore further, go ahead and carry forward some pretty confidence in a particular scenario before we even open the solicitation? We wouldn't want our project sponsors to be asking for any of these roadways when we could have just included them by default. So no recommendation, but any thoughts on the expansion proposal?
So I'm not sure how to make that conversation, but yeah, I guess my thought is two things. One, question the state highway system, right? I mean, it makes sense to add it all in. I guess I'm just curious why it was not included previously. Was there any rationale, or was it just not because they were further out maybe? I'm just curious if there was some decision back then, or it just was kind of not included.
Honestly, not entirely sure. So we just wanted to do a check at the beginning of this one. If we're saying that CO state highway system is on, are we missing any facilities? And since we did find one, this is one that we are pretty confident we'd like to include default ad hoc wise, but can't speak to previous cycles.
So I guess with that, I would sort of ask if anyone has concern about, you know, maybe the most aggressive one showing all 500 miles, right? That would kind of include all those connections. Anybody see that as a concern?
I'm going to kind of join in what David Kretzinger, City and County of Denver. I'm going to kind of join in what Brody said, that there may not be enough network density in eastern Adams County, southwest Weld, and eastern Boulder County, that if you just like double the network density of what we see up there, then that may be closer. Just having watched how Highlands Ranch has developed over the last 30 years, I think that whole northeast quadrant is going to develop faster than we think it will.
Yeah, I think that's an important factor. Yeah, Michelle.
I would love to see the principal, or at least the minor arterials and the major, at least the minor arterials included. That's something that we've struggled with, is having roadways with more than 10, 12,000 vehicles that I feel are regionally significant that are not included in the model has been a struggle. So super supportive of seeing that added in.
Christina Lane, Jefferson County. I do have a question on how the classifications were determined for some of the rural corridors between the minor arterials and major collectors.
So we used a CDOT data set that's available to us. It includes an attribute for the federal aid system. So we added the rural versus urban designation just based on whether it was within urban designated place, whichever term we're using now. But that relies on the system that's been provided to CDOT, and then we got that data from them. So that's one of the questions we have back to CDOT, is making sure those classifications make sense. And so I had focused on the local piece in my response, but if there are any here that don't make sense, we can help work with our local member governments to revise those within CDOT's master data set.
I think that would be helpful. I mean, just looking at for JeffCo, like Pine Valley, for example, I mean, we have data on some of our bridges through there where we only have a few hundred vehicles. Okay, so seeing that as an arterial is, I think, just a little confusing. I think the one thing that's interesting for us to kind of dive into this more so too is we just completed a study at the county for length restrictions on a lot of these corridors, recognizing that whenever there's an incident on I-70 or 285, there's lots of routes that are detours into unincorporated Jefferson County, some of which should not have anything greater than 25 feet driving on it. For example, we have, for those of you familiar with some of our roads, Douglas Mountain Road, for example, is unpaved with several 100-foot drop-offs. It is not wide enough in some areas for two vehicles to pass each other at the same time. So just kind of thinking through how these might work if it's identified as an arterial or even a major collector, that could imply to the public that commercial vehicles could be out on these corridors where we could be restricting these. Oh.
I'm not, Jacob.
I'll take the promotion. It's a compliment. So Christina and everyone, that's a really important point. I guess I want to make clear, for today, we're talking about rural, rural minor, rural collector, just to kind of show you the data sets and show you the roadways that we're considering adding. But I think at the end of the day, planning is an art and a science. And what really the question we're asking ourselves and we're asking you is, in these rural areas in particular, regardless of the classification of the road, is the roadway itself a key connector? And it's a balance, right? Because the rural roadways won't have the same volume of vehicular traffic that urban roadways will, but they can serve really key sort of network connections, access connections that they may be important in their own right, even if they have a fraction of the total amount of traffic. So I think at the end of the day, this is as much as anything an exercise on network building, network connectivity. Does it make sense to include these roadways or a portion of these roadways, regardless of how they may be classified in a database?
Thank you, Jacob, for that clarification. Now, Ron.
Thank you. And just to add on, I think one additional point, if there's some sense that sort of one of these scenarios is sort of on track, that does not have to be like the rule. That's exactly how we're going to do it. I think we start there, and then there can be some process to refine and make some logical sort of decision, as Jacob alluded.
A solicitation, I think I framed it as like addition. There are also always the opportunity to remove segments from our regional roadway system. So if there are particular segments that we propose, just by default, we'll have that conversation with you to make sure if it doesn't make sense, we won't include them in the regional roadway system.
Alvin, thank you for that. Yeah, I think we all see the map and we all look into our jurisdictions, right, and start focusing in and trying to look at each section, but at a high level, region-wide, right? I think you guys, DRCOG staff did a good job explaining the goal of trying to expand and make the right roadway connections, and then kind of, I think the comment we're hearing back is obviously vetting with all those jurisdictions and counties as we move forward to find out, do those actually make sense or not? That sounds exciting.
Ron, do you want just like a straw poll, raise of hands, like which end of the spectrum do we all feel like we're at, the 203 versus 503 miles added?
All right. So we're going to go old school. Raise your real hand, right? You can't virtually, you can't. So yeah, we'll start with sort of the comfort level of looking at all three of these colors, the blue, the magenta, I guess, and the yellow, and then obviously working with the counties and the jurisdictions to continue to refine them. So who supports that?
503, correct?
Yeah, that's correct, the 503. I could have used the number versus the colors. Yeah, that's true. 500. All right, great. All right, we'll put our hands down now. I don't know if anyone did it, but does anyone really more support reducing it more to that 263 miles and not really including the rural arterials? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for that unofficial vote, Alvin, and we look forward to an official one later on.
Thank you.
And again, thanks to all TAC members. I think that was a really good conversation and a lot of good questions. So thank you for engaging. One reminder, because I always forget, do introduce yourself, right? TAC members, introduce yourself when you make a point. I forget all the time too, but that way we have the record. Ron did a good job of showing us how to do that. So, okay, our next item number 6, the 2026-2027 Unified Planning Work Program Kickoff. This is attachment D in your packet. And Ron Papsdorf, the Director, Transportation Planning Operations, to present.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all. Thank you for this time. I'm actually going to tag team with Josh Schwenk a little bit on this. I'm just going to do some higher level framing of this conversation and then hand off to Josh to walk through some of the details, description of our current Unified Planning Work Program, and sort of a little exercise with you to get some initial inputs. Let's see if I can remember how to. So I'm going to do a little bit of an overview for those folks that are newer to the process, talk about what the Unified Planning Work Program is, and then Josh will go through our existing plan as well as some interactive steps. So for those not quite as familiar, and I know I'm talking to a pretty well-informed and educated group here, so forgive us for maybe being a little rudimentary, but I'll go through this fairly quickly. Just want to make sure everyone's starting from the same spot, because the Unified Planning Work Program is really important, but I want to start with sort of DRCOG and its function as the Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, for the region. So we're responsible for coordinating with our partners, CDOT and RTD, and our local government members, and a lot of stakeholders to carry out this continuous, cooperative, and comprehensive planning process for the region around transportation. There's a whole bunch of things that we need to do as part of that planning process, and the way we do that work and the work we do gets articulated in this Unified Planning Work Program, and we consult with a lot of interested parties, and the TAC is one way that we do that, the RTC, the Regional Transportation Committee, and lots of outreach and efforts with stakeholders and communities throughout the region help inform that planning process. It is meant to be a performance-based approach to planning for the region under federal law and federal regulation. There's requirements around our planning to be consistent with a regional intelligent transportation system architecture for us as a large MPO. And then we prepare a coordinated public transit human services transportation plan as one of those components of the planning process as well. Some of the other things that we do as an MPO is we have a congestion management process. Again, that's because we're a large MPO. Small MPOs are not required to do that congestion management process. We are. And then obviously a key function that we serve and that we just had a conversation about is the long-range metropolitan transportation plan. That's one of the core functions, requirements for MPOs, is to create that long-term vision for the region, to set out those strategies and actions and projects prioritized long-term with the resources we expect to have available. Also then make improvements or lay out specific improvements to implement that plan over time through the Transportation Improvement Program. That's the process, you know, that we lead in terms of allocating DRCOG directed funds to specific projects and programs. But remember that the TIP is also a collection of all investments that are made in the region, either that are federally funded, those have to be, or recently significant projects, regardless of funding source, are also accounted for in the Regional Transportation Plan and the TIP. And then the other required element is we do this annual listing of obligated projects. So federal law lays out 10 planning factors that we're meant to consider in the planning process. It doesn't tell us how to consider them specifically, and it doesn't tell them relative to each other how to consider them, but there are things that we do have to consider in the planning process. So this helps shape the work that we consider doing in the Unified Planning Work Program. Not going to go through all 10 here, they're in your packet, but they range from economic vitality to safety to security to the environment and integrating and connecting the transportation system over time, preserving the system, and then accounting for resiliency and reliability of the system. So all of these factors have to be considered. We relate when we do our planning work to these factors so that we can demonstrate to our federal partners that we actually are complying with the law. So the Unified Planning Work Program, again, this is the really important piece about how we collectively are going to pursue this metropolitan planning work under federal law. It lays out those major planning activities we're going to do. Most of it is made up of the activities that DRCOG will lead because we get a specific allocation of federal planning funds in order to pay for that metropolitan planning work. But there are elements within the planning or the work program that we also have to account for, whether they're led by CDOT or by a local jurisdiction like Denver or Boulder, Douglas County, that are also can be significant planning efforts, even if they're not using federal planning funds to be completed. They also have to be included and accounted for in the work program. A work program can be 1 or 2 years. Our practice at DRCOG is to do a 2-year work program. We think it's more productive to have a little bit longer view of the work that we're going to be pursuing together rather than doing this every single year. That also means we do some amendments to the UPWP occasionally as things change or adjust over time. But it lays out who's going to do the work, the schedule roughly for completing that work, the products that are going to result from that work, the funding by major activity or task for that work, and then a summary of the total amounts of sources of federal and matching funds that's pertinent to the federal planning funds we receive, but we also have to account for the other funding that's going to be used if it's sort of not a DRCOG-led activity, but it's a major metropolitan planning work. So we kind of start in developing the work program with sort of those things that we have to do. I hit on a number of those. These are things that are required of us as an MPO together that we have to do. So we operate and maintain that planning process. That's a lot of the engagement and collective work that we do together, engaging with each other to make sure that we're complying with all federal laws and regulations so that we all collectively continue to maintain eligibility to receive and spend federal transportation dollars. That's really important. If we ever did our jobs really, really poorly, we run the risk of sanctions from the federal government to say, you are no longer eligible to receive and expend federal transportation dollars. And it's not just the planning dollars that come to DRCOG, it's the federal funds for transit that go to RTD, or the formula improvement funds that go to CDOT. So there can be some restrictions. There's real ramifications for us not doing our work well. The Unified Planning Work Program is one of those required elements, the RTP, the Regional Transportation Plan, the TIP. performance measures, which you see regularly every year. We come to you for adoption of performance measures. None of this should be a surprise. Our congestion management process, and then the really important role that we play as an MPO in the federal air quality conformity work. So those are the things we have to do. So we account for those in the plan, in the work program. And then there's a whole bunch of work that we do that helps facilitate that, right? Because there's lots of different ways to to meet those requirements and do that work. So we maintain a really robust regional data catalog that helps inform our planning processes and help us make decisions around our planning processes. We have really significant land use and travel models for this region that provide information to all of us to help make planning decisions. We provide technical assistance out to local governments and our regional and state partners in their local planning efforts and otherwise. We do local transportation plan support. We have a transportation operations program that we operate here, and then a pretty significant transportation demand management program through the Way to Go program and our other TDM planning efforts. So there's a number of things that are currently in our regional or in the Unified Planning Work Program that we expect to continue, or we've got some on the horizon that we know are kind of coming up that we're going to have to deal with. So we know we're updating our regional transportation plan. We're required to do that every 4 years. We kicked that off late last year. We're going to be in that process. We're going to continue that work, and we're going to show that work and account for that work in the next UPWP because it's going to span into federal fiscal years 26 and 27. We know we're going to have a transportation improvement planning cycle or program cycle coming up in the time frame of the next UPWP, so we want to account for that work. We want to continue our Vision Zero and safety initiatives because that's a really important regional priority. So we know we're going to account for some of that work, and safety is one of those significant planning areas that the feds ask us to look at and what's important to our region. There's federal discretionary awards that have some planning components. We want to make sure we're accounting for those planning activities associated with recent awards. The transportation land use and connection and coordination is really important in this region. We've got some new state laws recently that sort of are reinforcing that, but it's also one of those planning factors that the federal government gives us through Congress about considering those connections. So how we account for those in the UPWP will be an important consideration. We know that development and transferring development around our transit investments is really important. Again, relates back to some of our more recent state law. And we're working on some transit or transportation efficient design standards that's carrying it forward from our current UPWP that we expect to extend into the next. Let's see, I think this is my last slide before I hand off to Josh. You won't have to listen to me drone on anymore. But we've got some continuing emerging and future issues that we also think are important for us to think about as we consider new initiatives or the work that we pursue in the next UPWP. So population employment changes are constantly happening in the region. They influence both our transportation needs and our opportunities, and how we deal with those really influences the work that we do. We've got an aging population. That's not news to any of you. How we think about that and how we plan for that is important. We want to leverage our transportation and land use for better outcomes, taking into account emerging transportation technology and how that might change how people interact or use the transportation system, but also how that affects sort of changes in our needs on the transportation system. Transit system optimization, mobility as service, greenhouse gas emissions, and air quality are obviously big overarching issues that we want to help influence sort of the decisions we make about what we pursue in the next UPWP. And then complete streets, micromobility, funding limitations. So how do we tackle all of these competing needs and interests and opportunities within the available resources we actually have to do planning work in 2026 and 2027. So again, I know I went through that fast, but I just wanted to give you all kind of a flavor for sort of the things that we hope you will think about as you give us some feedback on how we might focus our resources over the next couple of years on major planning initiatives, particularly in this context for this conversation, those activities led sort of by DRCOG with its federal planning funds, but certainly we'll take feedback on other big issues that might influence our work so we can work with other partners too.
Great, thanks, Ron. So
Following that kind of great introduction to all of our metropolitan planning process here in the region, we wanted to give an overview of what is in the current document to give you an idea of kind of the types of work that are included. So the document includes 9 objectives. Within each objective, there are a number of activities. So for instance, within multimodal planning, just as an example, there is an activity for active transportation planning. So it drills down a little bit to a more narrow theme. Within each activity, then, there's kind of a bullet point list of tasks. So to continue that example, within active transportation planning, there might be a task to update the active transportation plan. So that gives you an idea of kind of how this document is structured. I'll run through each of the objectives in the document to give you an idea of kind of what's included. So objective 1 is program administration. This is really kind of our general administration of the MPO program and compliance with our various state and federal requirements. The UPWP itself fits in this area, as well as staff development, training, attending conferences, as well as our MPO committees, including the TAC itself and the Regional Transportation Committee and Board of Directors. Objective 2 is really about public engagement and outreach, both to the general public as well as all of our local government jurisdictions. So the public engagement plan lives in this objective. All of our work to coordinate with FTA, FHWA, CDOT, RTD, and all of our local jurisdictions. We've made a concerted effort within the current UPWP to improve how we're distributing data around the region. So you'll have noticed a few more story maps being released, dashboards, including the crash data dashboard. That all came through this effort. And then as part of the state greenhouse gas planning standard, we were required to create a mitigation action plan, which included a lot of voluntary activities that local governments could implement, and providing some technical assistance and coordination with local governments around those are also included here. Objective 3 is really the land use planning objective. So MetroVision, our broad regional plan, that lives in this objective. Small area planning through our new livable centers set aside is included here, as well as all of that housing, transportation, coordination planning that we've begun. Objective 4, this is multimodal planning. Kind of the overarching planning document here is the regional transportation plan, but also included are all of the modal specific plans. So the active transportation plan, the TDM strategic plan, our complete streets toolkit, as well as our regional freight plan are all here, as well as all of the additional activities that go around implementing those plans. We also have our federal performance measures, so setting those are included here, and our new corridor and community-based planning set-asides are included here as well to help us to implement some of these. Objective 5 is really based on air quality, so this includes both our required air quality conformity analyses of the RTP and TIP, as well as some of the climate pollution reduction planning that we've begun with the preliminary and comprehensive climate action plans. Objective 6 is looking at short-term programming of funds through our transportation improvement program, really getting at implementing the priorities established in the RTP. Administration of the TIP set-asides are also included here. Objective 7 is really around how we operate our system. So this includes our congestion management process. This includes ITS work, our RTO&T, Regional Transportation Operations and Technology set-aside is here, as well as transportation security planning. Our Vision Zero and safety planning are here, as well as our innovative mobility planning, including the new TIP set-aside around that. Objective 8 is a little bit different because it includes activities led by both DRCOG and RTD. So DRCOG-led transit planning includes our coordinated human service transit plan, our FTA Section 5310 program, which is really around human service transit,
as well as our work with the Regional BRT Partnership. And then the RTD planning activities that are included here include their base system planning, so their financial planning, planning around facilities improvements and service levels, as well as their fast tracks planning. And right now that primarily includes Northwest Rail peak service. And then finally, objective 9 is around data and modeling. So a lot of the very important sort of background activities that help us to accomplish all of those other activities. So our GIS mapping tools, our land use modeling and transportation modeling work, and then all of the data sets included in our regional data catalog. That's kind of that open data portal for all of our work. So that gives you kind of an overview of what's in the existing document. It's a very broad document. It includes a lot. Trying to find my cursor, here we go. So now we wanted to get your feedback through a Mentimeter exercise. And all right. So for those of you with cell phones, you can scan that QR code. If you want to use your laptop, you can enter menti.com into a browser and enter the code 91339725. Once you're there, if you can hit the little button on the screen, I think it's a cat, that just helps me to know that you're there, so I can get an idea of when to move on. And once I move on, that little bar at the top that includes the code will still be there. So if you're not in just yet, you will still have an opportunity. Looks like we have 20 folks, 21 folks so far. I'll give it a couple more seconds and then we'll get started. Just to give you all an idea, we've gone through a similar exercise internally with staff to get their ideas, but we're going to do this with TAC, with RTC and the board to get all of your input on what we should include within the UPWP moving forward, and then provide that back to staff as they think through what tasks to include in the new document. So to get us started, just curious if you've ever looked at the UPWP document, and if so, was it relatively easy to look at, or was it challenging? And totally fine, you're not gonna hurt anyone's feelings here. If you found it challenging to navigate, or if you haven't looked at it, that is totally understandable. Looks like we've got 30 responses. Give it a couple more seconds, but in general, I think this is understandable. Most folks haven't referenced the document directly, but for those who have, looks like they're able to find what they're looking for. So next, just curious what, in your opinion, are some regional challenges facing the region, or if you're an optimist, what opportunities does our region have over the next couple of years that we can focus on through our role as the MPO? I see safety, asset management and preservation, aging, growth in traffic, air quality, federal grants. And again, we'll summarize all of these and provide these back to staff. I think it's very helpful for staff to hear what these challenges that might be facing your local jurisdictions are as they think through what they'll be working on. Great responses. We've gotten 28 responses so far. I'll give it a few more seconds. So if you're entering something, finish up typing. All right, I'm going to move us forward. Oh, as soon as I say that, there's always a couple more that pop in. All right. So curious what your opinion might be on where we might need to devote additional effort, resources, staff time in the future These categories are sort of based on objectives 2 through 9 in the current document. So just wondering where our maybe level of effort might be accomplishing what it is supposed to be, but where could we maybe put in some more effort in the future? A couple of responses starting to come in. Looking like operations and safety is really leading the pack at the moment. Give a few more seconds for you to finish up. I know there were a lot on this slide, so somebody really likes the cat button. All right, I'm going to move us forward. No. So if you could propose one thing that either DRCOG doesn't currently work on that you would like us to work on in the next coming years, or maybe something that we do but you think we should focus more on, curious what that one thing might be. We're almost done, I promise. Best practices around infrastructure management, housing affordability and TOD, emergency management, data, travel model data sharing. Really good responses so far. All about 5 more seconds, but as soon as it seems to slow down. See, we have 20 responses. Broncos Super Bowl. I'm not sure we can help with that one. All right, I'm going to move us forward. I believe this is our last question. What do you think is either important or the most urgent issues facing the region? These are just some issues that we had identified earlier in the process. I will just note, I think all of these are on a 10-point scale. If you could maybe give the most important or urgent one 10 points, the least 1 point, help to kind of divide them out. We understand they're all important, but help us parse through them a little bit. Responses starting to come in. Looks like funding limitations, definitely a big concern. Yes. For those who haven't used Menti before, the circle with the number in it, that's the average response, but then you can sort of see in the bumps, the hills above the line, sort of the distribution of responses that have come in. So you can see if responses are clustered or if they're kind of a range of responses. I do see we've got 29 responses. I think we had about 30 total participating, so I think we got most folks in. Oh, and there's 30. All right, so thank you all for participating in that. There we go. Just a couple next steps to run through, and then we'll be out of your hair. So we currently have some ongoing work with staff internally to determine what some tasks in the new document might be. So carrying over those things that Ron went through that are either required or that are continuing, but what might be some new tasks that they want to work on. We'll provide feedback from what we heard here today, as well as from our other committees to staff as they engage in those discussions. We're also engaging with our federal and state partners to make sure that we're complying with all of their requirements as well. We expect to have a draft document available for public comment mid-June and take that out for approximately 2-week public comment period. And then we'll bring that back to this group at the end of July for your recommendation with board action anticipated in August. So with that, happy to take any questions, any additional comments folks had. If I cut off your response while you were frantically typing it in, you can give that verbally. But I'll turn it back to you, Chair.
Yes, thank you, Josh and Ron, for that presentation. Any questions or comments from members? Looks like we put it all in the Menti. There you go. Good.
Thank you all.
If we do have any questions, we have both the contacts here to follow up, and we'll be having a chance to review this as we move towards that further approval in July. So thank you very much. All right, so that does conclude our discussion items. We do have 2 informational items today, and DRCOG staff is going to do a quick update on these items for us. These are typically meant to be read on your own time, but we are going to do a quick conversation about them. So the first one is item number 7, the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan, the 2025 Mitigation Action Plan Report, and Jacob Rigger, Multimodal Transportation Planning Manager, for a quick word.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Schmitz. So I was going to present on this, but then you all said it was the least important priority for the Unified Planning Work Program. So that's it. I'm not doing it. No, we wanted to include this in the packet just so you have it for your information. I'll just really briefly just say this is something that we do every year, as I think Josh alluded to, as part of our compliance with the state greenhouse gas transportation planning standard. We have a mitigation action plan. Since we do have a mitigation action plan, a requirement of us is to report on it annually to the Transportation Commission. Staff is in the midst of preparing this year's report, which by the state greenhouse gas rule is due to the Transportation Commission by April 1st of each year. So we do have a tradition of just kind of presenting to you and providing you the information about what's required under the rule that goes in a mitigation action plan annual report, kind of what are the issues that we're focusing on, how we put that report together. So that's all in the packet and in the presentation. So I'll just say if you have any questions, and particularly if you do have in your jurisdictions any work that you're doing in those mitigation measure areas, which relate to policy-oriented areas around transit-oriented development, mixed-use development, land use, parking standards, complete streets. We do want to know about them. Whether or not you think they count, we want to know about them because we are required to report annually on them. So if you have any questions about what we're doing in this space, or even more, if you have potential items for us that you want us to include, please feel free to reach out to me directly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jacob. And Josh made us vote 1 and 2 on some items, so it's his fault. So, all right, item number 8. The grant informational forms, and I think Jake's going to do a quick note on this too. Obviously, both included in your packet were several application considerations from jurisdictions for both RAISE as well as the PROTECT as attachment F in your packet.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So we largely covered this last month. We did receive a couple more forms, so we did want to include those, but just as a reminder for folks, we started doing this a couple years ago or more. Every time a major federal grant solicitation, a grant NOFO, notice of funding opportunity, comes out, we do ask you all, and ourselves as well, if we're considering applying for a grant, to fill out these grant information forms, really just to foster and encourage regional coordination. You can see what your neighbors are thinking about or what potentially you all may submit for these grant applications. So as these notice of funding opportunities come out, and as these grant information forms come back in, we do include them in the packet, again, just for communal information and the notion that you can coordinate with your neighbors. So don't really need a presentation on it, but contact information is available on the form for project sponsors who did submit the forms if you want to reach out to them. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and good luck to all those jurisdictions that are submitting those grants. With that, we'll move on to administrative items. We don't have any official items today, but do we have any member comment or other matters that were not brought up? Not seeing anyone jumping up. Oh, Mr. Pastor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ron Papsdorf, DRCOG. I just want to put on people's radar screen, you know, obviously with the change in administration, there's a lot happening pretty quickly. We're doing our best to sort of keep up with things, try to share out pertinent information as we have it. And I know we're all hearing different pieces. One thing I did want to flag for this group in particular, if you could think about, if you are going to anticipate needing any amendments to the Education Improvement Program TIP, look as far out as you possibly can. We heard last week some new guidance from Federal Highway Administration that they're going to be requiring a central headquarters review and approval of TIP and STIP amendments there, which is not the current, which has not been the previous practice. And, you know, think about the fact that there's 300 some MPOs across this country, 50 state DOTs plus territorial DOTs that all have TIPs and STIPs. And our latest understanding is that the Office of General Counsel is down to like 4 attorneys. So if they're trying to review TIP amendments and STIP amendments and potentially Unified Planning Work Program amendments, like that could potentially lead to some significant delays in the timing for federal sign off on those. So if you are anticipating, hey, we've got this project, we might need to be doing an amendment to it in the TIP, in our case in the TIP, the sooner you can sort of start those discussions and think about anticipating that need, the better, because again, we don't know. We're hearing lots of stuff. There's a lot of this that we're hearing verbally. Some of it has not been released in written guidance, but we're getting pretty solid sources from across the country that that's the case. We're still trying to figure out with CDOT and our partners about whether that or how that might impact us. So just, again, in a world of uncertainty, in a time of uncertainty, better to prepare and be thinking ahead. So just wanted to get that on everyone.
Thank you, Ron, for that update. Any other last items from any members? All right, with that, our next meeting will be back here on March 24th, 2025. And with that, we will adjourn our meeting at 3:12 p.m. Thank you all very much.